Red Bull have dropped the ball significantly during the mid-season development, and it seems like McLaren has come alive in the Drivers' Championship as well, with Norris being 70 points behind Verstappen with 9 races and 3 sprint events to go. Considering the dominance that the MCL 38 demonstrated in Zandvoort, there is zero to no doubt that the Woking-based squad will be the team to beat in every race for the remainder of the season. But how does this affect Verstappen and Red Bull, and what's the message that the 3-time world champion had to say to his team regarding this situation? It goes without saying that the RB20 has dropped from the most dominant car to one that could find it very hard to compete for podiums and wins in just a matter of a handful of races. And if we're to look at the points scored from Monaco onwards, you would understand the dominance that McLaren has presented on the grid. The MCL 38 has scored a combined number of 250 points in this span, whereas the RB20 scored just 166 points, which is less than Mercedes, who has scored 197 points, and similar to Ferrari, who scored 158 points. Obviously, McLaren is doing something very well with their car, and had it not been for the mistakes in Canada, the crash in Austria, as well as the strategy blunders in Hungary and Silverstone, Norris would have been much closer to Verstappen in the Drivers' Championship. And now Marco believes that this is a challenge that needs to be examined further from Red Bull, because they're now being threatened in both categories, not just the Constructors' Championship. And as all things stand, it's now a question of when, not if, McLaren passes Red Bull. The gap in the Constructors stands at 30 points, and when talking about this situation to a greater extent, Marco said, "We could not keep up with McLaren's pace at all. At the beginning, the pace was equivalent, but then the tyres started to wear, and you could see how easily Lando overtook us. And when Lando drove 1.13.8 on the very last lap without DRS, it shows that McLaren was clearly superior here. We also have to remember that Perez's last stint was faster than Max's. They were driving with different setups. Maybe it wasn't the right choice that we gave Max more downforce, because we weren't fast enough in terms of top speed, and it didn't help us in the corners." This is something that both Verstappen and Horner have agreed on, and according to Viaplay, when they were escorting the 3-time world champion to the podium, he was visibly upset with the setup of the car, as well as the upgrades that are now slowly but surely turning out to be downgrades for the RB20. It's obvious that he will ask a lot more from the car, and when addressing Marco's comments, Verstappen made sure that there will be no stone unturned, but also admitted that while the problems were quite visible in Zandvoort, it's not something that happened overnight, and it's a long-standing issue that has just started to haunt them. Elaborating to a greater extent, Max said, "I think this weekend was just a bad weekend in general. We need to understand that. But in the last few races already, they haven't really been fantastic. So that, I think, in a sense, was already a bit alarming. But we know that we don't need to panic. We are just trying to improve the situation, and that is what we are working on. But F1 is very complicated." The fact that both of the cars ran on different setups, and the fact that the free practices were limited, which meant that the team had limited amount of time to collect data, didn't really help Red Bull at all in Zandvoort. But a defeating fact for Verstappen might be the one that he drove a car that had a flaw that was developed months ago in Bahrain. This just goes to show that the team might be clueless at this point, and when talking about the situation, Jos Verstappen sent a fierce warning to Red Bull as he stated, "Maybe I shouldn't say it, but I'm doing it anyway. The fact that you have to go back to the car from the beginning of this year says enough. Red Bull just don't have it right here at the moment. I think they should take a good look in the mirror. Max knew this was coming, he just didn't have a chance. This way, it's going to be really tough for the rest of the year. Max is doing everything he can, but he doesn't have the material to finish it. It was already exceptional that he qualified second." The problem for Red Bull is that the dominance that McLaren is showing, as well as the lack of performance that they are struggling with now, seems to be more like a general, not track-specific thing for both of the teams. And with Piastri being an extremely competitive driver, Max cannot count easily on P2 finishes throughout the entire season. Yes, it's also hard to imagine that Norris Norris will win the remainder of the 9 weekends, especially on a race like Monza, where the low downforce configurations will aid Ferrari and Red Bull a bit more than they did in Zandvoort. But nevertheless, it's clear that he will be the candidate to win it all, and Verstappen will have a lot of a harder time finishing in P2 rather than Norris finishing P1. According to Marco, the issue with the car revolves around the tyre wear, and this is something that we've seen happening in Austria, where on top of the slow pit stop for Verstappen, Norris was in striking distance in almost no time on the new hard compounded tyre. The crash itself has helped Verstappen a lot more than Norris, because the Dutchman effectively finished P5 and gathered much needed 10 points, which could prove crucial for the Drivers' Championship. Elaborating on the tyre issue of the car, Marco continued, the big problem was the tyre wear. Verstappen started sliding and couldn't push anymore, but in the end, of course, he controlled the gap to the back. Up front, he had no chance. We are clearly being beaten, so that is alarming. I do think it was partly down to the track though. It was also about the relatively low temperature, and it was interesting that after the pit stop, Piastri drove about the same pace as Lando and nothing worked when he was stuck behind Leclerc. Unfortunately, that was not the case with Lando when he overtook Max. The situation is now definitely alarming in Red Bull, and as Perez said, the meeting that they had before Zandvoort was more about the performance of the car rather than the driver's choice, which is something that we can easily understand now after Zandvoort. This might also be the reason why Horner doesn't want to talk about Lawson being promoted or any other driver in that regard, because the issue is quite clear. The car is not nearly where it's supposed to be, and the design is flawed to a point where a fix might not even be available for the 2024 season. The Verstappen factor can only do so much when you regress so hard that you could find yourself fighting with 2 McLaren, 2 Mercedes and occasionally a Ferrari driver while having zero to no help from your teammate at all. Even the P2 finish for Verstappen here was a blessing, because had Piastri's engineer managed to draw a better tactic for him, the Aussie could have easily been in striking distance for P2, effectively stripping down 3 more points from Verstappen in the Drivers' Championship. This is something that McLaren will definitely aim at for the remainder of the season, and when talking about the upcoming race in Monza, Verstappen wasn't very positive about what is waiting for the team in Italy. As the 3-time world champion said, "I don't know if the balance is the main problem to solve in Monza. I mean, we just need to figure out our balance issues, and I think that will also help a lot with the tyre deg. In Monza, a lot is new: tarmac, curbs, even the layout in turn 1 and 2. So also that is something that we need to understand a bit more, and we know that we have quite a bit of work to do." The situation with the car's performance is also not looking very good from Perez's side, who, while he had one of the best weekends recently as he finished P6 behind Sainz, still had a lot of negative thoughts about the car, stating that it has a fundamental issue, and that is usually not the best thing you'd want to hear, even if it's coming from your second driver. Elaborating on the RB20 to a greater extent, the Mexican driver went on to say, "In general, we didn't have the pace today. McLaren and Ferrari were faster today. The good news is that we understand what is happening with the car. We have a fundamental problem with the car that will take time to solve, but it's a lot clearer where we need to improve. So we will see in Monza, a completely different circuit, where we can be." It's been quite a while since we've heard the Dutch and Austrian anthem, with Verstappen's last win coming in Spain and him entering a 5-race winless drought that might continue for a longer period if Ferrari manages to find surprising pace in the SF24. Obviously, the goal for Red Bull is loud and clear: continue where they started in Bahrain, but with the latest developments made from McLaren and Mercedes, as well as the high expectations that Ferrari have for Monza, the situation might get very critical for Red Bull in the following period. That will always result with issues in terms of Verstappen's satisfaction with the team, because as his father said loud and clear, Red Bull needs to open up their eyes and see where they are doing wrong, because it's likely that his son won't tolerate the downslope as much as they're hoping him to. With all this in mind, what do you think about the recent situation in which Red Bull have found themselves? Let us know in the comments below, and once you do that, have a look at the video that's appearing on your screen right now.